I'm very happy to introduce to you my colleague, Will Donnelly. Professor Donnelly was born in Nashville and grew up in Gainesville, Florida. He attended the College of William and Mary in Virginia, where he studied international relations. He studied international relations, economic development, and English. After his BA, he worked as an analyst for the U.S. Federal Trade Commission in the Bureau of Competition, where he founded the Federal Trade Commission Writers Workshop, and as a senior commercial lines underwriter for Nationwide Insurance. In 2006, he left the finance industry to return to school in creative writing, earning graduate degrees from two of the country's top creative writing programs. At the University of Iowa Writers Workshop, he was a teaching writing fellow and served on the board of admissions for earning his MFA in fiction writing in 2008. While at Iowa, he wrote a collection of short stories entitled A Silent Flash of Cold White Light, a thesis directed by the Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Marilyn Robinson. Later that year, he left Iowa to pursue a PhD in literature and creative writing at the University of Houston, where he was a presidential fellow and a Brown Foundation fellow. At the University of Houston, he completed a second collection of stories for his dissertation entitled Artificial Hearts, Love Stories. Over the past 10 years, he has taught college courses in creative writing, literature, and composition, and he has served as an editor for the Iowa Review and Gulf Coast, a journal of literature and fine art. Currently, he is a fiction editor and social media coordinator for Jude magazine, and this is his fourth year as a faculty member in the Department of English, Rhetoric, and Writing here at Barry. Dr. Donnelly's work has appeared or is forthcoming in Barrel House, Hobart, the Potomac Review's Best of the First 50 Issues Anthology, Quick Fiction, Green Mountains Review, Dragnet Magazine, Punchnell's, Hank, the Houston Chronicle, Smoke Long Quarterly, and elsewhere. His short story collection, Human Needs and Desires, is now complete and is in the process of editorial review at several presses. He is at work on a novel called Avalon. In an interview asked about his background as a musician, Will's a drummer. He responded, "I love the music of language, the rhythms of human speech, and I often read books aloud when no one else is around, just so I can hear what they sound like. My favorite authors really are also talented musicians, even if their music is made up of only words." This love is reflected in the finely tuned cadences of his own stories, in the music his own words make, and the resonant characters they give voice to. These characters live and linger with the reader because of the empathy Will brings to them, and because of his careful attention to the evocative detail. Whether it's the man with the odd pallor, as though he spent all his time indoors or were carved of wax, or the retired carpenter and ex-Marine who spent his days building fishing lures from cork and thread and feathers, or the mother who rather than goodbye ends all of her phone calls with, "Be careful," or the young woman who calms by watching the street, the light of the street lamps against the woods, the shining asphalt, the occasional sheriff's car rubbering past. Each is made vividly and humanly particular, yet each still radiates mystery. His stories are more concerned with questions than answers. In his refusal to drain his character's experience of that most of realities, uncertainty. There's a deep humility, a sincere respect for human experience, for its mysteries, and its often uncomfortable truths. Mystery, he has said, is what makes us curious and draws us together, what makes us subjective beings and keeps us humble. It's at the heart of all our fascination with the world. His are stories that make us curious about his characters and about ourselves, stories written with humility and heart, with an artist's eye and a musician's ear. It is our privilege tonight to hear them. Please welcome now Professor Will Donnelly.
So I requested the high pulpit because I've never seen anybody do anything up here. I thought it would be fun. I brought two stories tonight. I think I'm only going to be able to get through one of them in the time that we have, though. And when I got here, I realized they both involve dying animals. So sorry, but. The one that I'll read, at least first, and like I said, I think this is probably the only one I can get through, is called A Mirror in the Darkness. I wrote this draft several years ago, but I kind of hauled it out again recently and started tinkering with it a little bit. And it's the short story that I've been working on a bit most recently. So this is A Mirror in the Darkness. Thank you, by the way, for A Mirror in the Darkness. When the snake bit Luke, Luke jumped back and barked. Marshall had been collecting blue crab traps off the shore when this occurred, and he turned his head in time to see the red-brown hide of a narrow snake sidling away into the marsh grass. Marshall grabbed Luke around the neck to keep him from giving chase, then felt the tiny streaks of blood on Luke's flank. At the house, Marshall's father, Isaac, helped to tie a bandage around Luke's shoulder. "He's not swelling any, is he?" Isaac said. "No, sir," said Marshall. "This doesn't look like nothing, just a love bite. No poison, I don't think, but we'll keep an eye on him in case." Marshall knew fishermen on White Oak Key, friends of his father, who had received the harmless bites of copperheads and moccasins before. It was unusual, but when the snake duck sensed much danger, it might only prick its fangs into a victim and save the venom for another enemy. Enough to frighten, nothing more. By midnight, though, the area around the bite had grown to the size of a softball. And a few hours later, Luke was moaning on the floor, unable to stand, bits of foam bubbling at the corners of his mouth. "You're going to need to take him up to Dr. Winston at Cypress Key as soon as he gets light out," Isaac said when he found Marshall sitting with Luke in the kitchen in the still dark hours of the morning. "You can take the John boat. Give him some water for now and keep giving it to him. He'll make it as long as you keep flushing the poison out." Marshall poured water across Luke's tongue. When it pooled on the floor beside his head, Luke lapped up as much of it as he could. A fog materialized during the night, and by first light it cloaked the woods along the island shore in a haze so thick that one tree could barely be distinguished from the next. Mist even clouded the ground, and from a standing position, even the earth seemed chalked out and blurred. "It'll burn off in an hour or so," Isaac said, glancing out the kitchen window. "Here, take these." He lined 4 gallon jugs of water along the counter, then handed them to Marshall and picked Luke up to carry him outside. "And what if it stays?" Marshall said, stepping off the porch into the yard. "What, the fog?" "Yes, sir. It won't." Isaac knew the waters and the nature of the weather off the coast. He had lived for 50 years on White Oak Key, and had seen fogs like this one before, especially in late summer when the nights would be long, but the days were still warm. Out of a long, hot night would grow clouds along the earth to make the woods as thick and blinding as steamed milk, as silent as the surface of the moon. Walking through the yard, between the trees, the only sound that Marshall heard was the crushing of pine needles and the snapping of wet sticks. The John boat's hull made a scraping sound as it slid off the sand into the shallows. Isaac laid Luke gently against the bench seat in the boat's bow, then reached into the water and tossed the rope to Marshall. "Keep giving him that water," Isaac said. "You give him that water a little bit every 15 minutes. And you know where Dr. Winston works, right?" "Yes, sir, just down F Street by the grocery." "You're going to do just fine, Marshall. Ought to be there by noon or just a little after." Marshall pulled the cord to start the outboard motor, and the rattle of its engine roared through the silence and mist. Oily smoke blossomed out across the wake. Marshall steered the boat out, but even before the boat was into a channel, before it drifted out of sight and into a white nothingness, he saw Isaac spit on the sand, turn, and walk away. Luke was still, only his eyes moved. They were nearly closed, and his tail, most days long and furry and waving, now braced itself stiff against the hull. When Luke had been a puppy, Marshall had not yet been allowed to take the boat out on his own. Luke used to stand in the bow and listen for the sounds of the sea. He growled a weeping mullet and diving gulls, and Isaac had said that Luke could smell when the fish were biting. Luke sometimes leaned out over the water with his ears up, sniffing at the ocean. Isaac would drop a line right there and hand the pole to Marshall. Soon enough, the pole would arc, and Marshall would pull up a fish, shining and bending in the sunlight. Luke had grown slower with age, but still he loved the water and to sit with Marshall on the shore on summer evenings after school, where he would snap at moths or sometimes just stare at the horizon, lost in lazy thought. "We'll get you back to health," Marshall said. "We'll be fishing again before you know it." Marshall opened one of the gallon jugs and poured some water against Luke's tongue and closed it again. "This has got to last us," he said. "I'll give you more later." In darker water, Marshall turned the outboard handle, feeding power to the engine. To the port side, a channel marker materialized. An old plastic milk bottle painted orange bobbed in the wake of the boat, then disappeared into the fog. Waves slapped the bow in gentle rhythms, and when one was taller and louder than the rest, Luke raised his head, wincing, and then lay back. Marshall strapped the emergency oar against the gunnel to keep it from banging about. Marshall could not hear birds or crickets or frogs or any other living thing on White Oak Key. The fog and the sound of the motor blotted out all sounds and left Marshall in an audio blind. He only knew that he needed to steer the boat west out through the channels, then north along the mainland coast until he saw the pier lights of Cypress Key, or the pier itself if the sun was out. From the pier, he would only have 3 blocks to walk to Dr. Winston's clinic. Luke had visited Dr. Winston before, once to be fixed, and once for a strange illness that had robbed him of his appetite for 4 days and nights and left him almost dead. Yet Luke had lived 9 years on White Oak Key without a local vet, and it made Marshall angry when people called him old. Morning passed, and the sun became a white disk in the east, a tarnished nickel against the fogged-out sky. Waves lapped at the John boat hull, but the water was invisible more than 10 or 12 feet to either side. Even a depth marker more than that distance away would disappear. "Luke," Marshall said, but he said it for no reason other than to hear something in the whiteness of the mist. Luke raised an eye, turned his head a little. "You're a good boy, Luke. Want some water?" Marshall gave him a little water from the jug, then took a swig of his own. The fog did not change in brightness or in hue. The day stood motionless, and the sun, which could never materialize completely, began to fade again behind a bank of clouds as thick as concrete. 2 hours of this passed, and Marshall trimmed the motor to a hum. The waters could be shallow, there was no way to tell, and a broken propeller might mean a night at sea. He gave Luke water every 15 minutes, keeping an eye on his watch and monitoring the compass that Isaac kept on all his boats in case of an emergency. It told Marshall that the boat was heading northwest, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was wrong, that he should have passed Yankeetown already, but he'd seen nothing. Perhaps it had been lost in the fog. He aimed the bow due north and continued. The coast slanted to the northwest, so traveling north would bring land into sight eventually. There was no sun anymore, though. The sky was a blanket of cream. The fog was rooted to the sea. Marshall watched through the dark line of trees along the mainland but saw nothing, only whiteness, whiteness, whiteness. He gave Luke more water and held a northward course. Hours passed, and though the sun had never appeared, the sky began to grow darker. The color of the clouds changed slowly from thick white to soiled gray. And though rifts sometimes showed between the cloud banks, they did not reveal blue sky. By dusk, with no lights or stars, navigation would become impossible. We might just have to camp tonight, Marshall said. We want to make it, though. We've got plenty of water. He fed the dog more water, now from the second jug. The first was empty. Night brought with it a darkness more complete, more suffocating than any Marshall had seen. Still, he had not been on land, not even past the channel marker, and the thickness of the clouds inked out all the stars. Only around the edges of the boat there seemed to cling a glow in the mist, something like St. Elmo's fire, but dimmer. Marshall had cut the engine and was now drifting, waiting for the fog to clear, and realizing that though they did have water, they had no food aboard. There were a jug and a half of water left, but Luke's tail had gone completely limp. Marshall thought of his father, how he would worry but refuse to show it. He knew that Marshall would spend the night at sea if he had to, that both Marshall and the dog could go a day and night without food if necessary, and Marshall would not fail him. He had never tried to survive at sea, but it was a step he had to take eventually before he could take the big boat out on his own to fish, before he could fish for himself, and Marshall was no stranger to the sea. Still, he looked eastward, searching for a dark line of trees, a lighted depth marker, or the lights on the pier at Cypress Key. He listened for the clang of buoy chains, the foghorn of a barge, but there was nothing. Only black and fog and the lap of waves against the hull. At least there's no storm, he said to no one. We could use the water. And then, with a glance to his right, he saw it, small, bouncing like a moth in the distance, a yellow light. As soon as it appeared, it was gone again, swallowed by the fog. "Hey!" Marshall cried. "Hey!" There was no response. And then the light appeared again, bouncing a little. Marshall pulled the engine cord once, twice, and then caught. "I'm coming in," Marshall shouted. He drove toward the light, watching it disappear and then reappear again a few times before finally becoming steady. And he saw that it was not moving at all, in fact, but that he was, that the light was fixed. "We got land," he whispered to Luke. "It's land out there. We're about to hit it. We're about to hit it." Luke panted and braced himself again against the waves as the boat sped toward the light. But the light was closer than it appeared at first, and Marshall had to cut the engine before the propeller ran around. He took the oar out of the strapping and began to paddle, guiding himself toward the light, which now seemed to flicker, but which was steady on land. He shouted again, and still there was no sound. And then he saw a shadow pass between the light and himself. It moved quickly and seemed to amble from side to side, though Marshall only saw it for a second. He shouted at the shadow, but heard nothing until there was a splash of wading into shallow water. He saw a tattooed arm reach out onto the bow of the boat and begin to pull, but could only see the man's back. He walked quickly through the water, even when it came nearly to his waist. "You gonna get out and help me?" the man said. Marshall's stomach sank. The voice was filled with something like haste or anger, layered in a sort of gritty drawl. It was the voice of someone missing teeth. "Well," the man said, almost turning around. Marshall dropped the oar, which banged against the hull, and he jumped out to help push the John boat from behind. "We got to hurry," the man said. "Who are you?" said Marshall. "My dog's dying and we're hungry. We can help. You just come on. When he said it, the man stopped for half a moment to glance at Luke, still resting in the hole and blinking his eyes wetly. The glance was not enough for Marshall to see his face, though, and when he turned back, he nearly leaped up to the sand, pulling the boat as far up toward the edge of grass there as he could. "Where is this? What's your name?" Marshall said. "It ain't important," the man said. "My dog is dying." "Well, my name ain't important to you," the man said, running over to Marshall and tapping at his chest. His was the face of a young man who had lived hard. A scar ran down his forehead, across his nose, his chin and neck, and into the neck of his t-shirt. The two top teeth were gone, and at least one bottom, and a patch of blonde hair was missing from the side of his scalp. His jeans, now soaked with seawater, were torn and faded, and his t-shirt had a large hole near the waist. He looked at Marshall with a pair of sapphire eyes that seemed to Marshall somehow beautiful, only for an instant. "My name ain't important to anybody right now," the man said. "You bring that there water with you and come with me." "My dog," Marshall began. "You just come," the man said, gripping at something inside the waist of his jeans. Marshall lifted the jug and a half of water out of the boat and said to Luke, "It's okay, I'll be right back." His voice shook, though, as he said it. It didn't come out right. "Come on," the man said, already deftly navigating the roots and limbs of the forest floor ahead. As they grew closer to it, Marshall could see that the light came from the window in a small plankboard house. The window was minuscule, but it was the only opening in the place that Marshall could see, aside from a narrow door. The man walked toward the door and opened it, standing just inside to wait. Marshall walked toward him, but nearly fell across the doorstep when he got there. The man reached out to steady him. "Step down now," the man said. The dirt floor inside was lower than the ground around it, and the house at first appeared to have only one room, all of it lit by a single oil lamp on a table by the front wall. Marshall looked around and saw a small wood stove in one corner, built both for cooking and for heat, and an old insurance calendar tacked to the wall that included a faded photo of a vast, undulating orange grove, its trees aligned with rows of perfect green. There were a table and a chair, both made of rough sawn wood, and a cot to one side of them. On the cot, Marshall saw the legs and feet of another man, supine, his feet inside a pair of boots, these on the end of a pair of stained blue jeans. The rest of the man was hidden from view by the table. "Go on," said the first man. "You take that there water over to him." As he walked closer, Marshall could see that the man on the cot was breathing deep and quick, and that his stomach was large and round, protruding like a perfect sphere above the rest of him. He was not wearing a shirt, and there was blood, dried and brown and smeared across the man's enormous abdomen, issuing, it seemed, from a wound in his chest that had been covered by a large patch of gauze. Marshall noticed the smell in the room like wet copper, underlaid with humid soil and rotten earth. He tried to place it, to determine what combination of events could have produced it. "Sweet Jesus," the fat man on the cot whispered. "Oh, sweet Jesus." His voice was hoarse and labored. Marshall saw up close that he was bald and pale, and his eyes were also blue, the same sapphire tint as the thin man's, but that they rolled up toward the wall, then toward the ceiling, then down at Marshall, then back around again. "Oh, sweet Jesus," the man said. "He done lost a whole bunch of blood," the thin man said, standing close behind Marshall. "My dog," Marshall said, "he got snake bitten late last." "You want to know how much blood he lost?" the thin man said. "My dog is going to die." "You see that there gallon jug?" the thin man said, motioning toward the jug with his chin. Marshall looked back at him, trembling. "About that much," the thin man said, "and now he's losing his mind." "If he lost that much blood, he ought to be dead," Marshall whispered. "And yet he's alive," the thin man said, suddenly angry, pointing at the fat man on the cot. "He lives. But he ain't going to live much more now if you don't pour some of that water across his tongue. There ain't a well out here that works, and I've given him all we brought already. Marshall looked again at the fat man, seeing now that his face and scalp were as white and smooth as the bellies of fish, and that his forehead was covered with tiny globes of sweat. He looked to be the same age as the thin man, but also rough and hard-lived. Unable to face the fat man's rolling eyes for long, Marshall looked to the table by the cot. On it were 2 piles of money and a large pistol. The money was collected into bricks of $20 bills, tied with rubber bands. The pistol, a large revolver, aimed toward the wall and clearly loaded, was longer and more frightening than any that Marshall had ever seen. "What's that?" Marshall said, not meaning to speak, but finding the question coming through his mouth before he could stop it. "That don't concern you," the thin man said. "What have y'all been doing tonight?" "He got stabbed about 5 hours ago. That's what we've been doing. And that's all you need to know, son. Now give him some water." "My dog, Luke, I need to get him to Cypress Peak and give him this water. Save it for him." "You're looking at a dying man," the thin man said, his eyes narrowing at the words. "You don't give him that water, I'm going to give it to him." Marshall unscrewed the half jug of water, lifted it, and poured a little into the fat man's mouth. When the water touched his lips, the fat man closed his eyes and slurped quickly, pulling some in between his teeth and forcing the rest down his chin and across his face, down to where it stained from cotton dark. "More," the thin man said. Marshall poured a slow stream until the jug was empty. When the water stopped, the fat man lay back and breathed more slowly, his eyes now relaxing, his legs stretching out, then shifting back into a more comfortable position. Marshall reached for the other jug, the last full jug. "Not yet," the man said. "You got to feed it to him slow. You got to wait." "I need to give this to my dog," Marshall said. "I need to go. I need to get to Cypress Tea and get us something to eat." "You're going to give it to him," the thin man said, pointing with his head at the fat man. "You just sit down on that chair there and you wait till he needs more." Marshall sat down, not yet willing to let go of the water jug, and stared at the fat man. Marshall saw that though the man's face and head were white, his torso and arms were bruised in places, cut and scarred in some. He looked like a wounded soldier back from battle. The thin man waited a moment, thinking this over, and said, "He got a dysfunction. He can't feel no pain of any kind. Had it since he was a baby." The thin man stopped and waited a moment. Light cast like oil that wavered across the room, leaving parts of it in shadow. "I once seen him get his foot run over by a truck, and he just stood there, looking at it, like he didn't know how that could have happened. No pain at all in him." The thin man suddenly smiled. "Now what do you think about that?" "Can you feel where he's hurt now?" Marshall said, pointing to the gauze-covered wound. "You can feel something there, but it don't hurt it none," said the thin man, serious again. "What happened?" "You done got stabbed, like I said." "How?" The thin man stared at Marshall and spat on the floor. "That ain't none of your goddamn business," he said. "Give him some more." Marshall opened the full jug of water, the only one left, and began to pour it into the fat man's mouth. The fat man breathed and lapped it in, and what was left trickled down the sides of his face and darkened the deep green cloth of the cot. Marshall poured a quarter of it and said, "I need to save this." Suddenly the fat man lifted his head from the cot and hissed, "That dog of yours is dead." Marshall shook at the sound of the fat man's voice and spilled water on his gauze wound as he stared into the fat man's eyes, which were now steady, even, and open wide. The fat man's face was wild and angry, and with his hairless scalp, his face contorted to the face of a screaming infant, furrowed with frustration and rage. He looked down at his gauze, touched it with a thick hand, and lay back again, his hands at his side, watching Marshall all the while. The thin man jumped up and ran to Marshall's side. "Give him some more," the thin man said. Marshall poured a little more, emptying half the gallon jug, and started to cry. "It was fate that brought you here tonight," the thin man said, seeing the tears on Marshall's face. "Fate brought you to save a man's life." "Where's Cypress the key?" Marshall said, choking on the words. No one spoke. "Where'd that gun? I bet you didn't know when you got up this morning that you could save a man's life today, did you?" the thin man said, smiling again, his hand on Marshall's shoulder. Marshall capped the jug and sat down again, wiping his face on the sleeves of his shirt. The thin man took the fat man's hand in his own for a moment and leaned over his face, then left him and sat down again across the room. Where he sat, his face was half in shadow. "I bet you didn't think about nothing like that," he said finally, finishing his thought from before. "You're doing a real kindness, a great act, and that man over there on that cot ain't never going to forget it." Marshall tried to think about what his father would have done, if he would have grabbed the gun and shot the man and left. But no, Isaac would never commit an act of violence against another unless his own life or Marshall's were in danger. Marshall tried to think that his father would have done the same thing, that he would have given the water to the man to save his life, that he would have had to let Luke die in the hole of the John boat outside. He would have done it all the same, except that he would not have cried about it. He would have kept all that inside. Marshall felt suddenly ashamed, took a deep breath, and wiped his eyes. "You didn't have to keep me here," he said to the thin man, composing himself. "You could have just taken my water and given it to him. You could have let me and my dog go on." The thin man looked at his hand and breathed for a moment. Finally, he said, "But you got something else we need." "What?" "A boat." A lump moved in Marshall's throat. "Are you going to leave me here?" The thin man ran his fingers through his hair, snorted, and said, "Give him what's left." Marshall poured more water into the fat man's mouth, but when he had poured half the jug, the fat man sat up and pushed the jug aside. He rubbed his face and pulled a t-shirt on over the wound, then grabbed the jug out of Marshall's hands. "I'll drink it as I want now," he said. He dabbed his face with tissue from his pocket and sat still, breathing. Then to the thin man, "I'm ready. We ain't got time to waste." "You sure you're feeling all right to leave?" the thin man said to him. "I'll make it," the fat man said, and took a swig of water from the jug. "Let's go then," the thin man said. "Come on." The thin man stuffed as many bricks of money as he could into the pockets of his jeans and dropped the rest into a small cloth bag. Then, pistol in hand, he blew out the lamp and motioned for Marshall and the fat man to follow him. The room was lacquer black without the lamp, and the only light was that of the moon from the outside coming in. Marshall walked toward it, feeling the fat man's breath behind him. Again, the thin man held the door for him to walk through. He stepped up and out into the yard, and, looking down toward the Gulf, saw that other than a low mist that now clung to the bases of the trees, the fog had cleared away. Above, he saw the stars between the pine boughs, bright and cold and still. They lit the roots and pine cones on the ground and allowed the three of them to navigate their way down to the John boat, behind which the reflection of the moon made a rippled silver line across the water. "That your dog?" the thin man said as he pushed the boat in. Marshall said nothing. The three of them waded knee-deep, then climbed in. Marshall and the thin man helped the fat man over the side. He moaned with his injury. "I thought he couldn't feel pain," Marshall said. "He don't feel pain, but he feels something." Marshall lifted Luke into his arms and laid him across his lap. The dog's body was perfectly limp, but still warm. His eyes were open, as was his mouth, but his tongue had disappeared inside it, and there was a stillness in his body that felt, to Marshall, unnatural. "How much gas you got in this thing?" the thin man said. But Marshall didn't answer at first. "Huh?" the thin man said a moment later. "There's a spare 5-gallon tank next to the one I was using already." "Ought to be plenty," the thin man said, squeezing the hand pump on the fuel hose. "Your dog is dead," the fat man said, and stared at Marshall, and the fat man's face grew sad. The thin man pulled the engine cord hard, and the motor started immediately. He steered the boat out into deeper water, away from, but not out of sight of the shore. When they were far enough out, he twisted the throttle, gunned the engine, turning the boat to the south. "You was coming north?" he shouted to Marshall. Marshall nodded. "And you done passed Cypress Key." Marshall looked at his watch. He'd been in the house with the men for just over 2 hours, and the sea was now clear of fog. In the darkness, the stars were bright enough to see the waves ahead and the white V of the wake that spread behind the boat. The Milky Way spread over them in a great white ring. "Where are we going?" Marshall said, but no one answered. The fat man, his face serious, watched Luke. Marshall saw Luke's fur blowing a little in the breeze and felt what he thought might be his breath, the rise and fall of his ribs, but realized that it must be the movement of the boat across the water, bouncing as it did across the wakes and waves. They passed miles of forest without a light in sight and never saw another boat. At one point, Marshall thought he saw a channel marker floating in the water, but it may have been a crab trap line or a piece of trash. As the boat moved southward, dolphins began to break the water before its bow. Their backs were black and smooth and shining in the light of the stars. Marshall watched them, noticing how fast they moved through the water, how easily they glided up and down, their dorsal fins curling over them when they crested, standing up again when they dove. He looked back at the men for their reactions, but the thin man stared only forward, glancing sometimes toward the shore, a lock of hair blown back from his face by the wind, while the fat man sat on the floor of the boat, examining his fingers and popping his knuckles. Dolphins meant that there were fish in the water, and Isaac had said to Marshall many times, and they meant protection too. Dolphins liked to escort a boat from which they thought they might receive a fish or two in return. Marshall thought that if they knew who was aboard this boat, if they knew that they would receive nothing from him and the men who had nothing to give, that the dolphins might leave. Still, he watched their backs break the water, wondering at their innocence, hoping they would stay. Finally, in the far distance, he saw a light. It was not the light of an oil lantern, but the strong white fluorescence of a vapor lamp. As they approached, more lights appeared, and an even line behind it, and Marshall could see that it was the pier at Cypress Key, extending outward from the town into the ocean. The thin man turned the throttle and steered the John boat toward the pier. "We wanted to drop you off here," he said, his voice lower now, not having to fight against the sound of the engine. Marshall felt Luke's body for any sign of life, for a pulse deep within his neck, but he felt nothing. He looked to see the dolphins again, but they had left when the boat slowed, and the water around the bow was now a glassy calm, unbroken. As they rode past the deserted beach, Marshall saw the salt plastic buildings of the waterfront looming tall and dark, stilted just above the sand. In one window, he saw the thrown blue flicker of a television's light, but otherwise the town was sleeping, still and silent. The thin man cut the engine to almost nothing and pulled the boat gently up to an empty floating dock, bumping the boat against the tires that hung along the wooden piles. The air was redolent with the smell of fish and oysters. "You can get out," the thin man said. Marshall climbed out and kneeled on the dock to lift Luke. The fat man stood and took Luke up in his arms, looking over him carefully, and then he leaned down and whispered something in the dog's ear. Marshall tried to hear what the fat man said, but did not. When he was finished, the fat man handed the dog carefully to Marshall, then leaned back and sat down. "You've done a real kindness tonight," the thin man said to Marshall, his voice low and measured. "I won't never forget what you've done for me," the fat man said. "You saved my life, boy, by what you've done. I thank you for that, and I won't never forget it, never." Marshall nodded. "You had a choice to make between the life of a dog and the life of a man. You made the right choice, the noblest choice." "I had no choice," said Marshall. "Oh, yes, you did," the fat man said, his face contorted. "Yes, you did, and you chose a man's life before an animal's. You had a choice and you made the right one. You chose my life when you could have taken that revolver and shot both of us, me and him, turned and walked right out that door. The fat man turned and rubbed his eyes, then thrust his jaw again at Marshall, his eyes wide and clear and blue. A man's life is always the right life to save, and I will never forget you for that. The fat man's voice grew softer when he spoke, and when he finished, he sat back down. The thin man pushed the boat away from the floating dock and turned the throttle, moving the boat away from the pier and out into blackness. Never, the fat man shouted again, shaking his head as the boat moved away. As they steered back out and into darker waters, Marshall stood and watched the fat man, who looked back at him, his head still shaking, a worried look in his sapphire eyes. Even after the John boat rounded the end of the pier and left his sight, following a southward course, Marshall heard the whine of its motor and smelled the fumes of gasoline which stuck to the dock. When he could no longer hear anything except the clap of waves against the piles and the breeze, he climbed the steps to the main pier and walked, looking his arms toward the mainland. When he reached the shore end of the pier, there was a chain link gate that had been closed and locked for the night. Marshall pushed it open a foot or so and helped Luke through, laying his body on the concrete on the other side. Then he climbed the fence, picked Luke up again, and walked out into the street. There were a few cars parked on the street, but the town was deserted. Marshall listened and thought he heard snoring from one of the windows far away. He began to walk, whispering to himself, F Street, F Street, F Street, and watching carefully for street signs. In the shadows of a palm tree beside a utility shed, Marshall saw a hose and spigot. He hurried to it, set Luke down, and turned the spigot on. When water flowed from the hose, he poured it into Luke's mouth, watching for movement. He thought he saw his tongue move a little, just a little, but thought then that it may have been pushed by the water. He realized suddenly that he was thirsty too, and brought the hose up to his own mouth and drank, feeling it move down his throat and filling out his empty stomach with coolness. He drank until he was full, then wiped his mouth and poured a little more for Luke, wishing there was something nearby to eat, but there was not. Come on, boy, he said, drink, come on. He laid the hose in the grass and put his hand by Luke's nose to feel for breath. He felt something, but it may have been the breeze, which rattled the palm fronds above him. He turned the spigot off, picked Luke up, and walked further into town. When he found F Street, he followed it, walking faster now, seeing Dr. Winston's office in the distance. Several of the yellow vapor lamps on F Street had burned out, and the path was dark and treacherous. More than once, Marshall nearly tripped across a buckle of the pavement. The glass door of Dr. Winston's office acted as a mirror in the darkness. Luke in his arms, Marshall examined his shadowy reflection in the glass. He looked at his face, his eyes like dim sockets, and then at Luke. He thought of how, without much light, they seemed a single being in the ripples of the glass, joined together at the level of his chest. He set Luke down upon the step before the door. Again he felt her breath, and for a moment he thought he felt the movement of air from Luke's mouth. He put his hand into Luke's fur against the dog's neck, feeling for a pulse. His body was still warm, and Marshall felt the faintest beating of a heart deep within. It's going to be okay, he said. You're going to be all right. You're going to be all right. He stroked the soft fur around Luke's neck, and then he said, goodbye. Anyone awake in Cypress Key at 4 o'clock in the morning, anyone looking out his window at that dead hour, might have thought he'd seen a scarecrow walking past. That was, in fact, what Dr. Bill Winston thought he saw at first from the window of his house along the beach. The house in which he lived with his wife, 3 dogs, 9 cats, and 10 loud birds. He thought he saw a living scarecrow, or at least a man who looked like one, limp and haggard, walking slowly through the streets and toward the pier. Bill Winston sometimes sat up 2 or 3 nights straight, unable to find sleep, unable to relax in the rare nocturnal silence of his home, even as his wife snored away. He sat that night as he always did, by the ocean window, his face lit by the glow, the orange tip of a cigarette, watching the exhausted stranger climb up over the fence of the pier, then amble down it toward the end. "What's that fool doing out there?" he whispered in the quiet, leaning toward the window screen to see more clearly. A dog's ear moved at his feet and fell back into slumber. He watched the weary figure reach the end of the pier and climb up on the top of a large concrete pile, carefully avoiding the fluorescent glare of the pier lamps, hanging his legs over the side of the water and resting his elbows on his knees. The figure grew completely still, completely quiet and alone. Bill looked out to where the stranger fixed his gaze and picked up his binoculars. With them, he searched for a boat or an airplane or a light. Whatever the stranger was watching for out there, he saw nothing. Nothing in the sky or on the water. Nothing on the beach or the waves. Bill looked until the sky grew pale with dawn, until the stars had faded and the moon had disappeared. Yet he saw nothing past the pier. Nothing but the vastness and the blackness of the Gulf. Thank you. In the time we have left, are there any questions? Yes, Andy and Olivia?
Could you tell us what your novel is about?
A little bit. It's, yeah, Avalon is about a boy and his father who go and set out on a something like the Appalachian Trail, but it's not as well maintained. And while they're camping out and the father's trying to reconnect with his son, they meet a stranger who's not only a stranger, but strange. And odd kind of supernatural things begin to happen around them. The trail begins to move on its own. And where it gets a little scary is where she follows them back to town, and things in the town begin to change as well. I don't want to give away too much more than that, but it's kind of a thriller. And I didn't really realize that at first. I want it to be exciting. And I love reading thrillers, so it would be fun to work on. Olivia?
I actually had the same question, but I suppose I'll ask another one.
Okay.
This short story, is this based on a specific place that you've visited in Florida or an experience you've had? Or?
A little bit, yeah. A lot of people, I think, when they think of the Florida Keys, think of like Key West, Key Largo, Marathon, all the keys that are down in kind of branching off the southernmost tip of Florida. But there are actually other keys, small islands along the Gulf Coast in kind of north central Florida and up in the Panhandle. And I've written several stories about Cypress Key, which to me is a stand-in for a real town called Cedar Key. And Jim, I'm sure you can be that place. And then White Oak Key is a kind of more rural key near there in my imagination. But I do have several stories that take place in those areas. And those areas around Cedar Key, in so many ways, they look a lot like old Florida. It's like they haven't been overdeveloped. But it's kind of scary because they're starting to be developed. Condos are going up, and and some of that old Florida culture is disappearing more and more. But I have a couple of different places that I tend to set my stories that are just imaginary, and that's one of them. Is these little islands on the Gulf Coast of Florida. That's cool. Anybody else? Brooke?
What made you want to go back to school? Or was there like a moment that you're like, this is not what I want. I want to go and do writing instead of this?
That's a good question. Yes, there was a moment. I was working in the insurance industry, and it was okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I wasn't passionate about the job in any way, but it paid bills and was comfortable work, I guess. Every night when I go home, I would write and read. And during that time in my life, I was just tearing through books. I mean, I read all kinds of stuff, and I thought, man, how could I get a job where I just worked with writing all the time, writing and reading? And then one morning, it was a Saturday morning, and I was driving to Publix to get some groceries, and I was listening to this radio show that it's rarely on anymore, but it's called Car Talk. You know Car Talk? Yeah. And I thought to myself, it's these two guys, these two brothers, and they both went to MIT, and then they became car and auto mechanics, and then they got a radio show, and they were really hilarious. They give people car advice, and they make jokes all the way through it. And I just thought, these guys really like cars, and they figured out a way to make that work and be able to do their job and have a lot of fun. They're very successful with it. And I thought, why can't I just figure out a way to get into writing? And so I started applying to grad schools. And I got into some places that I wanted to go. And I quit my job at the insurance company and just moved to Iowa. It was fun. It was fun. I loved my master's program, especially. PhD was fun too, but more grueling. Yeah.
I really enjoyed the story. I also enjoyed some of the titles that Sandy mentions in the title of the story too. Where do you get those? I mean, they're the first words that a reader probably sees. Very artful, very important. They just come, or do you sort of labor over that?
Titles are hard. I think that they're very important in part because they become the terminology by which we refer to the stories. And so, if you're talking about a good man is hard to find, you're going to have to say a good man is hard to find. And, it becomes kind of the handle that we hold on to. In this case, it's a mirror in the darkness, and I think of kind of the climax of the story being this moment when Marshall is looking at the glass and seeing himself in reflection, and seeing himself on some level change, that he's able to say goodbye to his dog in this moment. But I also think it's a moment that for him is a little bit ambiguous, because he feels like maybe he's done something good by saving a man's life and sacrificing his dog to do it, but he's not sure. And so I wanted the title to focus on that moment in this case. But generally, titles are tough, I think. I had a mentor once, a long time ago, who said you should always pick a title that, if it were in an anthology, and someone picked up the book and didn't know any of the authors in it, that title should stand out to somebody. I thought that was an interesting idea, so I like titles that are strange a little bit if I can. Yeah, Tom.
So, is this album the first novel you've really tackled, or have you started others, finished others, or why that novel? Why move from the short story to the novel?
Well, part of it is the publishing industry. They often want you, agents and editors these days prefer novels to story collections. And so it helps to sell a story collection if you've got a novel in the works that might be sold later or somehow combined together. That's what Jamie Corson is doing. He's finishing up his novel right now. But yes, I have written another novel, and nobody will ever read it. Because it was sort of a failed experiment that I wrote during my PhD program. But it was a good experience. I think I learned a lot about the process, the pacing, the way that novels kind of spread out a lot more than stories. And I think it gave me a lot of insight into the novel that I'm working on now. So it's not wasted, and I still have it, but even I don't want to read it. Anyone else? Yes.
Do you start with a character or a thought or a storyline? How do you create?
Sometimes it's a moment, an image, and other times it's a line. I'll start with a sentence, and I'll repeat that sentence over and over and over again in my head. This was back when I worked for the insurance company. I went around for days repeating this one line to myself, and it was soft September dawn, an overturned rowboat lies silent in the rain, and a flock of geese taking off taps its many wings against the lake and disappears into a pine-bound cove. And I just said that over and over to myself. I wrote it down several times, and then slowly a story grew out of it, and I started just adding more. And sometimes it's that just kind of the music and the mood of a line that can produce something like that. But other times it's an image. In short, I don't really know. It kind of comes out of just a very simple idea, and then it's just a matter of what happens next. Keep going.
Nice. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Anybody else?
She also enjoyed your Facebook post over spring break.
Thank you. Yeah, spring break was wild.